All right, welcome to your first e-learning day for the next 30 straight days. Uh, the French Revolution is a subject we've said is pretty important. It's a huge, major deal. It's what we're going to spend our next few classes on, even though it's spaced out quite a bit. For this one, it's going to be the lecture-based. And this will be the only lecture that we're going to do during this period of time. So it's pretty long. You will want to take notes. However, I'm not going to stop like I normally do at class in order for you to take notes. Instead, you're going to want to hit pause regularly. Also, if you find my voice irritating, there's nothing I can do about that. However, you can decrease the volume quite a bit. And so take your time going through here. These lecture notes are going to be important in the next few e-learning lessons where you'll have more graded assignments. So this is kind of a prerequisite that is absolutely required to do. So we are finally at a point in history where the American Revolution is actually beginning to occur. And so the founding of our country, which we started talking about at the very, very beginning of school, how America has not been around that long, we are finally at the point in history where America exists, which means we're almost done. And the American Revolution is largely a huge issue within the French history of the French Revolution. And so we're first going to examine those American roots. This is a pretty simple question. When does the American Revolution end? Most people are likely to say 1776. Not quite right. See, the war goes from 1775 to 1783. We basically declare independence in 1776, but England wasn't nice enough to just say, oh, good, go ahead. We fought for it, and we fought all the way till 1783. That is a long period of time. And what it initially started as a fight against evil, crazy King George, it morphed into the Enlightenment, a concept that men could rule themselves, that we did not need an absolute ruler sent down by God through the divine right of kings in order to do this. In fact, the American patriots said, we don't need a king at all. Instead, we should be able to elect our own kings. That concept of enlightenment is a second Renaissance phase that goes throughout the world, but particularly into Europe, of enlightened thinking, with science and reasoning being at the forefront of them. Here are some Enlightenment ideas that you've benefited from: freedom of speech, equality, freedom of press, religious tolerance, are all things that come out of the Enlightenment. But to remember, if these are new ideas, they were ideas that were not in Europe at the time, specifically in places like England and France. After we win the war in 1783, we decide to create an entire brand new government system, loosely based upon two ancient European kingdoms, the ancient Greeks, democracy, and the ancient Romans, the republic system. Our very first attempt is an utter failure. We called it the Articles of Confederation, and at one point in those articles, we attempted to make George Washington king, literally replacing Mad King George with our own King George. Thankfully, George Washington said no to being king, and they scrapped the Articles of Confederation, which had put the states ahead of the national government, and eventually began working on the Constitution. However, up to this point, we were a totally weak nation without any government or allies. And so the first thing we had to do was secure those allies. We send in particular a couple of notable individuals to Paris, France, namely Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin. These two founding fathers will help secure our chief and most important alliance, France. We adopt the Constitution in 1788. And Thomas Jefferson spends about 5 years in France, and Benjamin Franklin spends 2 to 3 years in France. John Adams, our second president, was actually in Paris in 1779 and the Netherlands in 1780, working to secure support in the American Revolution. It was that support from Paris, France, that was absolutely critical to our victory, as England was unwilling to bring the full brunt of its army against the American colonies, for fear that France would attack them while the armies were away. That wasn't just random luck or the French thinking about themselves. That was the careful work of major political figures behind the scenes cultivating an alliance between the United States and France. So let's talk about our very first friend. During the war, the French provided supplies, arms, ammunition, uniforms, troops, and naval support to our army. It was critical. Despite George Washington being the founding father, the first president, and utter American hero, he lost virtually every single battle while leading the Continental Army. It was only as we drew out the war that the British finally gave up and we were able to declare ultimate victory. During this time, the French Navy transported reinforcements for us, fought off the British fleet, and protected Washington's forces in Virginia. Their assistance was absolutely critical to the surrender in Yorktown in 1781. We spent $400 million on that war, the Revolutionary War. That's roughly $10 billion of today's money. England, in fighting to keep us, spent 250 million pounds. France, which at the time had the livres, spent 1.3 billion livres. That's more than $13 billion on the American Revolution. And yet, when you think about the American Revolution, I'm sure you think about the United States. And obviously, you think about our opponent, England. But you don't necessarily think that it's France who is going to spend the most money. That's going to have some huge ramifications. Remember, France is already spending lavish amounts of money fighting wars to go against counterbalancing under Louis the Sun King. They also have bankrupted France a couple of times by building up Versailles, and his lavish spending and lifestyle did not go well when his grandson takes over, who was an absolute miserable ruler, Louis XV. He was the one that we talked about with the very weird affairs. So where did enlightenment happen in France? It happened in the salon. Some of the ideas that barbershops and hair salons still have this conversation where people come around to talk about ideas and shared ideas still comes from this notion of salons in France. Wealthy people would have these huge sitting rooms that nobody would use until they had a party. And in these parties, they wouldn't sit around making chit chat. They would all sit in the same room and they would talk about the major ideas of the time. Much the way we would gather in a room and talk about a TV show that everybody jointly watched that was ending, these guys would sit around and talk about the politics of the day. They became really important during this time in France because while the American Revolution is going, and while France is spending all of this money on the American Revolution, they're in for rough times. We talked before about Louis the Sun King and his lavish spendings and his love of gold. Now he dies in 1715. But he didn't leave France in great financial shape. In fact, when you decorate your palace like this for every single room in pure gold and gilded furniture, you're not going to leave behind a whole lot of money for your heirs. Versailles is covered looking like this. After Louis the Sun King came Louis XV. He's the beloved. He lives from 1715 to 1774, but he won't be ruler for very long at all. He's going to be very, very strange. He's mostly beloved by people because he gave out things, not because he actually did anything. Louis XVI is going to be the restorer of French liberty. We'll get to him. There's a few more Louis in this lecture. But the point is, after these Louis, the French system was totally bankrupt. And there was absolutely no way to fix that. That was because the people who had the money made the rules, and they made it illegal to tax the nobility. This made it impossible to raise any amount of money. For instance, if I'm a poor person and I make $10 and you tax 90% of my $10, you're going to get $9 of my wealth. Whereas if I'm rich and I have $1,000 and you tax just 1%, you're going to get significantly more from that 1% than you would taxing a poor person for 90%. With it being illegal to tax the nobility who held almost the entirety of the wealth, It meant that it was absolutely impossible to raise the money to pay the debts that they accrued from the American Revolution and the lavish spending of the Louis. Furthermore, within the country, there was a decade, 10 years of poor harvests. That made people not really willing to trust the government, because if the government couldn't guarantee a secure of food, how could they trust them for any of the other stuff? Here's some pictures. Louis XVI, the grandson of Louis the Beloved. He's going to marry Marie Antoinette, and she's a name you're going to want to write down. In fact, you've probably already heard her name because she fits into pop culture. She's even had a couple of recent movies made about her. She's the one who says, "Let them eat cake," which doesn't really sound that bad if you're a poor person and you come up to some rich people and you ask, "Can I have some food?" and the lady says, "Let them eat cake." It sounds like you're getting invited in and you get a delicious cake. Except for cake is translated a little bit differently these days. Cake at the time in France was the burnt portion stuck to the pan of whatever you had cooked. This is even more insulting considering Louis and Marie Antoinette threw lavish parties literally every single weekend. And at the end of the party, they threw out all of the excess of food. And it was a ton of food. Yet the people of France are actually starving. Marie Antoinette, who's not even going to be French, is going to be one of the most interesting and hated people of her time by her country. These two acted like the Sun King, but they didn't have the personality cult to keep it going. At the same time, they knew something was wrong, and so they attempted to fix it, which means they attempted to reform it. The problem is that they couldn't tax the nobility, and they needed to raise money. So Louis calls for the Estates General. The Estates General is the Parliament or Congress of France. That's a test question that you're going to need to know. So Parliament is going to be British, Reichstag is German, Duma is Russia, and French calls itself the Estates General. So he opens this sessions with a speech, and he points out that there's really dire circumstances. They are absolutely broke. They have to meet to be able to fix this problem. And he says the secondary problem is the people are starving. And because they can't raise taxes, the first problem, they aren't able to solve the second problem. He declares himself the people's greatest friend, and he beseeches the Congress people in the Estates General to allow him to raise taxes on them so they could solve the problem. Here's a painting representing Louis' speech. Louis here, standing up, pointing towards, is pointing out the dire situation as he beseeches them to do it. Now you might notice in this picture a couple of different groups of dressed people. The people in the front bottom right all seem to be dressed the same. That's because the Estates General divided itself into three different groups. The clergy members of the church, they're on the left bottom side. The nobility, that's who would be on the right with the powdered wigs, and then commoners. So, this is different than ours, and every country has different processes. You do need to know that Parliament was divided in three estates, hence the term Estates General: the clergy, the nobles, and the commoners. The numbers fluctuated from time to time, but for our story in 1789, there were 100 clergy members, 100 nobility, and 600 commoners, meaning for voting on pure democracy, the commoners are going to win every single vote. Because the nobles and the clergy were members of the establishment, meaning that they liked the current system kept them wealthy, the current system kept them powerful, they oftentimes voted as a group, meaning the 100 clergy member counted as one vote, the 100 nobles counted as one vote, and the 600 commoners counted as one vote. This oftentimes meant that on issues like taxing the rich or the church, you'd have a 2-1 decision, with the commoners voting for the tax increase to help feed the people, and the nobles and the clergy voting in their own self-interest to make sure that they were not taxed. That sets up a debate in all systems of change agents versus the status quo, a Latin term for the way it is. Change agents don't like the status quo and want change. In this story, that's going to be the commoners. The people who like the status quo means it's working for those people. The church and the nobility in France had it really well at this point in time. So, what happens when Congress and the king need to make change? They need to make reform. However, status quo agents say, I don't want to change because it works really well for me in my own self-interest. The system is, in short, preventing problems from being solved. When government can't do it, that's when people start taking justice into their own hands. Hence, we have a revolution. Before it gets bloody, however, they attempt a non-violent revolution first. The commoners, the third estate, walk out. They say if you guys aren't willing to raise taxes, which clearly is the solution to solving the problem, then this body is dead to us. It doesn't work anymore, and we need change. So they form the National Assembly. This is a replacement for the Estates General, and again, something you're going to want to write down for the test. It'll be the second of 3 parliament names we have, first Estates General, and now National Assembly. Now, they didn't have a building to meet, nothing fancy like the Estates General building or Parliament or our Congress, so instead they took over the nearest big building that they could, and they took an indoor tennis court. This leads to what's called the tennis court oath. Once again, a test question. So the National Assembly, as the commoners are now calling themselves, meet at the indoor tennis court, and they take an oath to stay and continue to work until they've got a solution. The king, who is a change agent at this point in time, because he knows his people are starving to death, actually sides with the National Assembly. As the people start going with the National Assembly and saying, look, they're willing to solve the problems, they're willing to meet in the tennis court until they have a deal, ultimately the king says to the nobles and the clergy, look, something's going to happen. You better be in the room where it happens. If not, you're not going to get any say or control. Here's a picture, here's a portrait of the tennis court oath. You can see, unlike the previous portrait where people were sitting down and it was very structured and organized, here you literally have the inside of a tennis court and you've got people screaming and yelling and people up on the top shouting down and screaming. It's essentially chaos while one person tries to come in. Yet if you look at the forefront of the picture, you have what clearly is a member of the clergy and clearly what is a member of nobility, meeting there with another figure either representing the commoners or, in this instance, the king, who are secretly making a deal and beginning to shake hands. When the nobility and the clergy came in, they made sure that they would make the reform as simple and as easy and less intrusive upon their own lives as they could, which ultimately will prevent real reform. Now, kings have to do other things. As the king, nobles, and clergy arrive, they, of course, come with the army for their own protection, because this is a group of rabble-rousers. They are the commoners. They want change. They are frustrated. They are angry. And at this point in time, word is going around that rumors are happening that a popular finance minister has just been fired. And worse, that there are grain shortages right around the corner. This is going to be a common theme in this lecture here, as the French people, who have dealt with a decade of harvest problems, are going to be in a food panic at all time. With the fear that grain shortages are imminent, and seeing the army coming around the National Assembly, the commoners put together 2 items that are not related to each other, but make sense in the time period, that the king is going to shut down the National Assembly rather than help support it. This is going to cause problems, specifically riots. So we talked before about that really big building in a previous lecture that was in the background of the picture of the Fronde, which was that fight with slingshots. It's a really old castle in the center of Paris, or at least it was. It unfortunately is not there anymore. As you'll see by the end of this lecture, it gets destroyed. There's only a few things in there. There's about 15 or 16 different prisoners in this entire castle, which is now a prison. And it had all of the guns in Paris. And so the guns are held up there in times of emergency, but because there's a castle in the middle of the city, it became a symbol of the king's power. So the Bastille is going to become pretty important. When the riots go out, they need to be able to target a place. They need the crowd to be able to meet. And while a riot might be interesting and unique, a riot with guns might be more revolutionary. And if the Bastille has the guns, the riot is going to find the Bastille. So they surround the Bastille. They demand that the lord in there, not the lord, the prison guard, gives them the guns. The king now comes by, sees his castle, a symbol of his power, surrounded by commoners who are attempting to overthrow it and get the guns. You would normally think that the king, in this case Louis, would order that the army fire upon these citizens, move them to the side, and restore the agency. However, this Louis is not normal, and he's going to make a huge mistake here. He probably ends the revolution right here before it ever happens if he crashes down on them. Instead, he wants to be popular. So he shows up wearing the militia's colors and showing support of the militia that wants to tear down his castle and steal his guns. That's when I was supposed to click. Doesn't make too much sense. The king supports the riots, and he told the assembly to create a constitution. In short, he threw his 2 cents in with the rioters and supported the riot. The leader of the Bastille did not end up too well. After the rioters got to the guns, the head guard of the Bastille lost his head, which then got trumpeted around on the top of a pike, literally right in front of the king. So the king is not doing anything here to support his actual own people. Instead, he knows there's a problem, and while this is probably not the way he wanted to get it done, he's going to use this opportunity to create a constitution, which ultimately will limit his power. They can't do it in the tennis court oath. That's too volatile. They couldn't do it in the Estates General because the National Assemblymen walked out and vowed not to come back to the Estates General until they had a constitution. So the king allows them to go to Versailles, about an hour away from Paris. Wonderful place, another symbol of the king's power. He's going to put them up in rooms. They're gonna get this done. However, I told you it's a reoccurring theme. Back in Paris, some women notice that there's a shortage of bread. Once again, there's fear of famine here, there's fear of death, there's fear that something is up by the king luring everybody to Versailles. So, the riots form again, this time march on Versailles to demand change. When they reach Versailles, they demand to the king. And the king says, no, there's plenty of bread, it's perfectly fine. And he says, I'll come back with you guys and show you. So while the constitution to limit the king's power meeting is going on in the king's personal palace of Versailles, the king decides to go back with the rioters. Not a smart move. You'll notice the quotation marks here because there are definitely air quotes in this moment. There's a so-called assassination plot in the middle of the night on the walk back to Versailles, and the rebels, now calling themselves the National Militia, kill the royal guards in order to save the king. Once again, they cut off their heads, they put them on pikes, and they parade them around. Now, there's nothing that says there was actually an assassination attempt. Instead, this really is the National Militia pretty much taking the king hostage. The king can't do anything because he's surrounded by a mob of these militia members, and so he returns to Paris with them, no longer volunteering to come, but instead being marched with his guards' heads being flown above him. There's some pictures of his guards. Probably not the best for morale boost. The king ends up under house arrest, which I suppose if you're king of England and your house is a palace, it's probably not as bad as the house arrest that we all feel we're under right now. Hopefully it's going well. We'll check in you much more in week 2 of all of this on your mental health. As bad as it is, being quarantined, even in a palace as big as the King of France had, he wants to escape, because nobody likes to be kept in. He is, however, caught in that escape attempt. He is returned back and forced to sign the brand new Constitution, which, like our first attempt at making a constitution, was utterly terrible, probably even worse than the Articles of Confederation. All of those Enlightenment ideas that got discussed around France and salons by Ben Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, who were invited to all of these parties while they were there and to talk about Enlightenment and the ability to not have a king and not have God choose your king. This Constitution is pretty pathetic. It's not going to last. So you just need to know it's bad. You don't really need to write a bunch of this stuff down because it's not enlightened at all. The king becomes a figurehead. Now that fits within enlightenment, but only landowners were allowed to vote. And so only a small few people would be able to have the power in picking the new ruler. They gave no freedom of the press, which will be important later on, no rights for women, and France officially becomes a constitutional monarchy, a country that has a king whose power is limited by a constitution. Today, England is still a constitutional monarchy, as the Queen of England is still in charge of the country, but she's very limited in what she can do because of their constitution. So this first attempt at a constitution is laughed at by the crowd. It does not deliver the change that they are demanding. The National Assembly gets labeled the Assembly of the Rich, sarcastically, because once again it has preserved the status quo for the clergy and the nobility who have all of the wealth. Because landowners are the only ones that can vote, essentially you have to be rich to have the power to vote, meaning nobody's going to ever pick a revolutionary leader. There's one political party that dominates this, the Girondins. This is going to be worth writing down because there's two political parties here, the Girondins and the Jacobins, that will become relevant. Under this new constitution, the Girondins expressly hold power and push their agenda through until a war starts, which is literally the weirdest war ever, because I'm pretty sure in wars, you're trying to win them when you fight them. Not quite this one. See, the three countries on here wanted war in order to restore the monarchy of France. That's Austria, Germany, and that weird bird thing is Prussia. Trust me, it's Prussia. These countries wanted to help Louis, who is still alive, locked in his palace, this time in a locked room, rather than just able to go anywhere he wants. See, the monarchies were afraid that if France successfully overthrew their king, then the Austrian, German, and Prussian people might think, hey, maybe we can overthrow our kings. So they come into France, fighting a war, hoping to destroy the National Assembly and the Constitution, tear it up, and restore Louis to power. Louis obviously wants this as well, as he doesn't really like being under arrest. So these three nations are trying to win the war. Well, what about France? Well, the king, who still technically is king, it's a constitutional monarchy, he wanted war, hoping that France would lose. He believed that if France lost, the other nations would put him back in charge, which probably would happen. Now, obviously, the rest of the French don't want to lose the war. Oh, wait, this is France. They did want to lose the war. The French legislature, at this point the National Assembly, let the king declare war even though they had the ability to check and balance him. They knew that they would absolutely lose. See, French Enlightenment ideas had come into the military, which is not a good place for Enlightenment to come in. See, these ideas that we are just as good, we are capable, we can reason out and think things, don't really work in the battlefield. During this time when the French are actually fighting this war, a commander will say, we just got orders that we need to go charge the enemy. And one guy, random guy, in the French army would raise his hand and say, I don't really think we should charge. We're probably going to die if we do that. And the commanders were like, but it's the orders. And the French soldier was like, yeah, but I don't think those orders are good. So, like, how about we vote for it? And then they would vote. How many people want to charge to be able to get to victory? Or how many of you want to run away? Not saying that they're cowards in any way, shape, or form, but the French army wasn't very good at this time, so oftentimes they voted to run away, significantly safer for them. The French legislature was okay with the army being this bad, because they figured once they lost, the French people would be so upset at losing to these nations that they would demand the death of the king. See, the king had cooperated at all of this point, except for his escape attempt. And so they didn't want to execute him for fear of causing a war, causing more riots. And so when he signed the Constitution to limit his power, he actually saved his life momentarily because they felt like they couldn't execute him because he was cooperating. Only if France loses, and loses spectacularly in war, could they manage to put the king to death for this. Meaning, the countries that wanted to attack France wanted to win. The king started the war because he wanted his side to lose. And the French Congress signed on to the war because they also wanted the French to lose. Which means there should be a pretty easy result here. It should result in a French loss. Spectacularly. The French people get mad at both the king and the Girondins. The king and the Girondins were counting on this, but they expected to be able to point the finger at the other side and survive the blame. For the king, they imprison him, and for the Estates General, the Girondins, they dissolve it, and they get their third group, this time the National Convention, meaning the first one was the Estates General for Parliament. The second one was the National Assembly as Parliament. And now you have a new group of people, this time called the National Convention. Oddly enough, on this day, France won its very first victory in the middle of the war. The French people and the French news took this as a huge, massive sign that they were ordained to win because they had finally changed leadership. Thus begins what we will call the final phase of the revolution, and it has to do with this lovely gentleman. His name is Jean-Paul Marat. He's on the test multiple times, and he becomes a very interesting figure because he's the very first person in history that we've talked about who utilized the news and the media to make huge, major changes into history. He also had really icky skin disease, which caused him to be in the bathtub for about 15 hours a day, which made his skin like super slimy. And so this is about the prettiest picture you're going to get of him. So who is Jean-Paul Marat? Well, he's a leader of a one-man newspaper called L'Ami du Peuple, the friend of the people. For the test, and for the sake that I probably didn't say that right in French, you just need to know that the newspaper was called the Friend of the People. This one-man newspaper went out on an all-assault upon the people of France, the National Convention, the National Assembly, and the king, mostly focusing on attacking the nobility. Every single issue of this newspaper, he seemed to find a new enemy within the government, and the French people ate it up. They loved this level of gossip and tabloid and news, and Jean-Paul Marat gave them that news, talking about all of the problems and patheticness that these leaders had done. For example, he once reported about a supposed plot to free prisoners to start a new revolution. His circulation was so believed, and so many people got the newspaper, that literally the French government killed 1,300 prisoners while they were in their cells. You figure if they get released because this news story is correct, 1,300 prisoners could do a lot of damage. However, instead of preventing their release, they just decided, hey, you can't come rescue anybody if they're dead. And so these prisoners, some of which were assuredly innocent, are literally murdered in cold blood within their cells. Unfortunately, Jean-Paul Marat and the Friend of the People were not exactly real news. This plot was probably just pure gossip designed to sell issues, and yet it had real consequences for those prisoners. He is eventually elected to the assembly and joins government. He fought all the time with the Girondins within the assembly, and he used his connections within there to attack them in print outside of the assembly. You can imagine that that created a whole lot of enemies for him within the dominant political party, the Girondins. Specifically Charlotte Corday, who will once again be on the test. She's a supporter of the Girondins, and she is sick of Jean-Paul Marat. So she gets dressed up one day, she goes to the hotel where Jean-Paul Marat lives, knocks on the door. His doorman and guard aren't supposed to let anybody in, but Charlotte is convincing enough to let her in. She comes in and Jean-Paul Marat is in his bathtub, which wasn't too surprising because, again, he spent between 12 to 15 hours in his bathtub due to this weird skin disease. And Charlotte plunges a knife into him. She is quickly arrested, and one of her famous quotes before she is executed is that she said, "I killed one man to save 10,000, putting an end to the gossip and rumors of this newspaper of Jean-Paul Marat. This is one of the most famous paintings of all of French art. It shows Jean-Paul Marat murdered in his bathtub while he is literally writing the next issue of The Friend of the People. Women murdering newspaper people while they make newspapers in their bathroom somehow is not the craziest point. After Charlotte Corday kills Jean-Paul Marat, the Girondins basically lose power. People begin to see them as kind of this crazy fringe group, and they decide they want change. And this becomes our second political party that we're going to talk about here, the Jacobins. They are radical. They are crazy. They are far way out there. They win the majority. And they've got a guy named Maximilien Robespierre, which is one of the best names in all of world history, and definitely one that you want to write into your notebook. Maximilien Robespierre takes over the party and the National Convention, and his governing policy gets described as terror. Not necessarily terrorism, but it both has the same goal: using fear to dictate policy. And there's two examples here. The first one is the law of suspects. Now, normally in America and other enlightened societies, you are innocent until proven guilty. The law of suspects flips that on its head. You are guilty until proven innocent. See, Maximilien Robespierre told the French people that people like Jean-Paul Marat didn't want the revolution to happen, that there were still sympathizers out there trying to get the king back, even though the king had been locked away for all of the last few years. If you were suspicious that somebody was anti-revolutionary, that somebody was against the revolution, you could turn them in, and they were assumed to be guilty. This allowed you to get rid of any coworker that you didn't like. This allowed you to get rid of a pesky neighbor that you did not like. Normally, I would say turn to your left and look at the kid that sits next to your left, and that would allow you to get rid of them pretty easily. Maybe that's your cat right now. The second policy is the guillotine. So many people were executed under the law of suspects that it took too long to hang all of them within the public squares of France. So Maximilien Robespierre sought to finance a way to kill people quicker. The solution was done by a doctor named Dr. Guillotine. He created a device that through gravity would have the blade sail down and chop off a person's head in one swipe, instead of, as a headman axe took, multiple times, sometimes gruesomely, and then your head would fall nicely into a basket. This allowed them to kill people significantly faster, and it kept the line moving and kept people not waiting in prison for their executions. The combination of the law of suspects and the mass murder happening within Paris by the guillotine kept people in fear. And when you're in fear, you turn towards people for help. For the time being, they turned towards Maximilien Robespierre and the Jacobins to be able to get their agenda through. They were absolutely terrified, and so they did things because of that they would regret later on. Kind of like how many of your families are going to regret buying as much toilet paper as they did. Seriously, that was weird. There's the guillotine. That's invented at this time. It's literally named after the guy who invented it. In the background there is one of the most famous buildings in all of France. That is going to be Notre Dame. That's church. When we talk about the French Revolution, there is fire, there are blades, there are death, all within the background of the church at this point in time. It's not a pretty time in history. So, who were some of the victims of the guillotine? First, you want to write down that they finally take Louis out of his prison and they execute him with the guillotine. They also execute Marie Antoinette, the queen who said, "Let them eat cake." Because honestly, seriously, when you're pretty hungry and she gives you a burnt part of the pan and then literally throws out the actual cake that you want to eat, you're probably going to want to behead her too. Charlotte Corday also gets the guillotine. After all, you can't commit murder. Even if you kill a guy who people don't like, still murder. And, literally, Maximilien Robespierre. See, people are only willing to be afraid for so long. After all of their friends, their co-workers, their pesky neighbors have been executed, people begin to start wondering when the government's going to come for them. And you can't keep people in fear forever. Eventually, they rebel, and Maximilien Robespierre himself was eventually guillotined. This ends the fact that 12 to 14,000 individuals were guillotined in Paris over the course of a year. More happened throughout France. So even though it was an efficient killing machine, there were still so many people that were being killed that you have a crazy, crazy amount of talk about this throughout all of France. So, what else did these people do? None of this will be on the test, but it's pretty interesting what their enlightened society did here while executing people. First, they gave an entirely free and universal education system. That means everyone got schooling, no matter who. They abolished slavery in 1794. So as crazy as these people were, they weren't nearly as crazy as parts of the United States were for still arguing in slavery all the way up until the 1800s. Divorce became easier for women to obtain. We've talked about this before. That's incredibly important for women's rights. Before divorce was able to be attained for women, they were locked into these relationships that were sometimes really, really bad for them. They introduced the metric system, which is not what we do, but it allows for a whole bunch of other number systems and measuring systems that confuse the heck out of Americans when they vacation. And they created a new calendar. Year 1 would be the start of the revolution. It had 40-day months, 10-day weeks, and 1 day of rest. So literally 10-day long weeks, weekend was just 1 day, every single month had 40 days. It didn't match up with the fact that the Earth goes around the sun in a heliocentric model in any way, shape, or form, but the French didn't really care, and if you made any of these complaints, you would just get guillotined, and so no one would make any of these complaints. And lastly, they banned women from talking about the government. So, there were some good things in there, mainly the top things, and some things that were pretty silly for the French, mainly the bottom things. However, grain is still a problem, and in 1795, once again, there are bread shortages in France. Without that bread, riots ensue and engulf literally the entire country, from the north of Normandy to southern Aquitaine to Paris itself. Riot is the word of the year. A young army officer at this point shows up, and he decides he's not going to side with them like the king did. He's not going to help them get guns with the Bastille. He's not even going to reason them and say, you know what, it's pretty bad, nobody has food. He just orders his men to start killing people with guns, and they start shooting all of the rioters. This pretty quickly puts the end to the riots, and that young man who ordered the killing of them becomes extremely famous, and somebody we're going to study over the next few classes. His name is Napoleon Bonaparte. I hope you enjoyed this at least a little bit. Again, today's class, you just need to take notes on this. Next class, I believe is Friday, we're going to have some questions about the French Revolution as well as some readings to go through. And so there'll be an assignment that gets turned in on that. This lecture should give you the foundation for most of what you need to do effectively on that assignment, though. Feel free to listen to it as much as you want. Have a good day.